this week of study, we want to look at what does it mean to obey as Jesus obeyed. So far up to this time, in week 1, we looked at that we are commanded to walk as Jesus walked, not looking just at his message or his methods, but the very model of his life. In the second week, we looked at the humanity of Christ, that Jesus was man as God intended man to be in his humanity. In the third week, we began to look at what we call the foundational priorities, that Holy Spirit power. And we looked at Holy Spirit dependence, how Jesus was led by the Spirit, guided by the Spirit, and did even miracles in the power of the Spirit. Then the next week, we looked at praying as Jesus prayed. His ministry began and ended with prayer. But this week, we want to look at obedience, obeying as Jesus obeyed. In his humanity, Jesus did what Adam failed to do. Adam was born into a perfect world, but chose to sin. Jesus was born into a sinful world, but always and only chose obedience. Every time I think about the obedience of Christ and reflect and try to think and act just like Jesus about his obedience, I realize that Jesus said over and over again that obedience is God's love language. 2 John 2, chapter 1, verse 6 said this, "And this is love, that we will walk in obedience to his command." Jesus understood obedience is God's love language. Some of the questions I hope that you'll wrestle with as you work through this study this week, I want to give you 3 key questions that I hope you think about. First off, what does it mean that Jesus learned obedience? Hebrews 5:8 says he learned obedience. If you're perfect, how can you learn obedience? And as a result, then, how do we learn obedience just as Jesus did? You know, it's interesting, in Hebrews 2, verse 18, it says Jesus suffered when he was tempted. Jesus understood that whenever you face temptation, you now have a choice. You can choose to obey or you can choose to disobey. If you disobey, it's in short term, it's fun because of passing pleasures of sin. But short-term disobedience produces long-term suffering. Jesus, when he was tempted, did suffer. Why? Because he chose to obey. And obedience, immediate obedience, can bring short-term suffering. But as a result, it produces long-term joy. And in that way, I think that's why Jesus prayed in the Lord's Prayer, lead him not into temptation. Because Jesus knew that when he was tempted, he suffered. But in that suffering, he was tempted at 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old, 20 years old. He learned obedience. I think as he obeyed and obeyed and obeyed, his faith muscles grew strong. And he became stronger and stronger in his ability to obey. That's why the scriptures tell us in Philippians 2 that he obeyed all the way to the cross, even death on the cross. He learned obedience. And I hope you think about and discuss what can we do that will help us learn obedience like Jesus. The second question I hope you think about and wrestle with is the question is, how do we raise the value of obedience in our own Christian lives? For Jesus, obedience was the highest of values. He said, I only and always please my Father, John 5:30. And he said, the world's got to know that I do exactly what the Father's commanded me because I love him so. Jesus lived a life of obedience, and he recognized that obedience is one of the highest of all God's values. I want you to look at Saul, how Saul chose half obedience. And what was it in Saul's life that caused him not to fully obey? And what is it in our life that sometimes causes us not to obey also? A third question I hope you wrestle with and think about is, how do we teach our disciples to obey? Matthew 28 in the Great Commission says we're to go and make disciples of all nations. But one of the things it says we're to do is to teach them to obey. Not just teaching them, some have called that the great omission, but teaching them to obey. I'm here in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we know that Jesus lived a perfect life, a life without sin. He never disobeyed. And the Garden of Gethsemane here, for me, represents that. Because here, Jesus, at the very end of his life, made a very difficult decision. He said, Father, if possible, take this cup from me. Yet not thy will, but my will be done. He chose to obey, even death on a cross, willfully going to the cross. The Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means olive press. And what they would do is they take the olives and they'd step on them and squeeze the oil out. Then they'd take the remains and put them in bags. And they'd put them in these gunny sacks, these bags, the remains of the olives. And then they would put large stones, weights, to press down harder and harder on these crushed olives. And out of that would come the purest of oil. And Jesus here in the Garden of Gethsemane, the weight of the sins of the world pressed down on him, so much so that he said he sweat drops of blood. You see, Jesus in Hebrews 12:2 says, he, for the joy set before him, endured the cross and despised the shame. The word endure is the Greek word hupomeno. It means he bore up under the weight of the sins of the world that was poured out on him, and obeyed all the way to the cross, even death on the cross. He never ever sinned, always chose obedience, and thus acquired righteousness for you and me. My prayer is, as you study the obedience of Jesus, that this week you will think in fresh new ways about how can I learn obedience? How can I elevate the role of obedience in our family, in our own personal lives? And then how do we help others to learn to obey, teaching them to obey all the commands of Christ Jesus, learning to obey as Jesus obeyed.